Hey class, so I chose the poet Frank Bidart to read. He was born in 1939 in Bakersfield, where he lived sort of a rural, outside of Hollywood life, and wasn't quite sure what to do with himself. He knew he was a gay white man, and in an environment that wasn't accepting of it, that was like you had to come out, and that was a huge thing. And being gay back then was looked upon as um, the result of bad parenting. So Bedart had to struggle with either be himself and like be alienated from his family, or be someone else for his family and then alienate himself. And so what you'll see in a lot of his poems throughout everything is a search for acceptance that he did not he reveals in his poems, he doesn't, and in his interviews, he didn't feel um, growing up. So Bedard goes off to UC Bakersfield and then heads out to Harvard, where he studies with um, Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop. And in his first debut collection, none of these poems had been published before, so that was an anomaly. And then he comes out with Herbert White, um, which is one of the most intense poems that I've read. It really shook me. I wasn't prepared to get into both a narrative and a dramatic monologue written in field comp with with subtle, and I wouldn't even say subtle. I mean, it's subtle, but it's expressive use of lineation that Bedart says is an intuitive thing. He just feels it. He tries to choreograph the lines as though it was dance choreography. It's not for reading aloud, but for experiencing your vision. He's writing for the reader here. And how you read it out loud, he says, is a different experience. In fact, he doesn't even read this poem out loud very much. He went for like 20 or 30 years without doing it. But since then, he's done some project with James Franco on the poem. What I like about it is the associative moves. You know, we see this narrative um, within like a lyricism, and at this time, you know, narrative had been diminished in lyric poetry due to a rise in just prose being sold in a lot. So Bedart was wanting to take cinematic narrative and put it back into poetry, and he did this through these excessively long, I don't know if excessive, but very long poems. And what I say is lyric is like the skull shows through, the night became clear, and the buds erect like nipples. That to me is an associative move to the natural world, to this decomposing body of a girl beneath him, that I think is Poundian, and he does say that he is influenced by Pound's ability to write epic length poems and put whatever he wants in them as long as he builds the architecture. And what's great about Herbert White is that he takes this monstrous character and puts us in that mind, and does it with a line like, and the woods were scary. All of a sudden, you know, this truly immature voice, the scariness, the boyishness, the fear, the truthfulness, it all comes out with that excessive use of uh, you have this visual caesura that's just like intense. It goes all the way across the page. Then you have the M dash, and then you have the exclamation point. It's like immature, but perfectly mirrors that boyish innocence that's created from someone who has a maladaptive way of dealing with anger. And I find that pretty fascinating and clever and brave beyond belief to go there and get to the truth of these things. But what we do see in By These Waters is a move within this same sort of themes of acceptance and sexual exploration, but it's a little bit tighter. We're looking here at 3 couplets and 3 sticks. It's not spread out in field comp across the page in the same way as Herbert White. Later, Bidart gets shorter. He has some shorter poems. He keeps his long poems, though. Here we still have that punctuation. It's a little bit freer. It's like, what begins in recognition, comma, M dash, ends in obedience. So while Herbert White's character is having that recognition of who he is and he doesn't like what he sees, and he can't stop himself from acting on those impulses. In this poem, 20-something years later, same thing's happening. What ends in recognition, or what begins in recognition, ends in obedience to the self, or maybe to another. Because this poem is also about a sexual dynamic. There are boys, and it's also the dramatic monologue of a John who's paid boys for sex. The boys unzip their pants. But no matter how much they charge, they're giving more than they get because our persona is on his knees weeping, which shows a desperate desire for connection and humiliation and shame. I think the setting is subtle here. It's almost imagistic. When the room went dark, the screen lit up. It's just one line which places this whole scene in a cinematic way, but it's slightly vague because I can't pinpoint. This is not the 29 Palms Motel of Herbert White. This is just a room with a screen. I'm in a sex library or something like that here. I like this sort of middle repetition here. It's got that ballad feel that we then see later in Valentine when he completely moves towards reining in his punctuational impulses and developing rhyme schemes. Felt, found, love, love, must be love, must be love. In both these poems, you can fold them in half, and there's that mirroring effect. So they're just deep reflections, and then he has the reflection of self reflected within the form. As he moves across his ove, he does still maintain the punctuational freedom that you see in Herbert White and stuff like that, but I do think that he's purposely trying to be more subtle. And he does speak a lot about investigating America's obsession with God as being, the search for God and finding God and being one with God was then replaced with finding true love and what is love. And it's just another fallacy created to make people feel bad, or at least for these people and this persona. And that's why I chose this, because throughout all these poems there's a cold, gritty investigation into the loveliest ideals or ideas, like how the dead used the word love bewildered and disgusted the boy, because he didn't want to use the word until he understood it, and he never really understood it. And then Frank, actually the author, and his ideas by tracking America's obsession with finding God and putting God in the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever like that, and then moving into this obsession with marriage and satisfaction and love and caring. That's a rather new shift that Frank has tracked through his poetry. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with him, and I just thought he was super interesting. He crafts the anti-hero often and says that One way in which to discover poetic freedom is to write back to yourself. To write a poem like, hey, Frank, and then you. And then the you is not the you are the audience, but the you is you, me, the poet. And that has led to him crafting some of these terrifically wonderful anti heroes. And I use that word because he did, because I don't want to say that they're heroes, but they're just, you know, debased individuals written with such care and perception into the human spirit and human experience. And I think it has a lot to do with his upbringing in California, in Bakersfield. He writes consistently about that. So that's Frank Bidart. He's got a Broadway production that just came out right before the COVID of his work with Ellen West. He's working with James Franco. So he's doing fine.